All right, so um, let's talk a little bit more about this theory of absolutism. Okay, um, because also again, when we think of Western civilization now, we think of democracies, right? A parliamentary system, um, a Congress, constitutions, these things, in which even if a monarchy exists, such as in Sweden or uh, Britain, um, the real power is with the representatives, right? In a democratic republic, type of situation. But at this time, we're going to see emerging out of these religious wars um, the rise of absolutism as a norm. Okay, and something that should be brought up here is that there's a fine line that's being drawn between a despot and an absolute sole legislator. Okay, so on one hand, being a sole legislator, this concept, right, is that not only can this monarch make all the laws by themselves, they don't even have to follow them if it's considered for the good of the kingdom. So, in other words, technically in the United States, if Barack Obama speeds or runs past a red light, or any of the Bush family or any of our top senators, they're not above the law. They're supposed, in theory, they would get a ticket, right? This is not the case here. Okay, so the sovereign is the sole maker of laws and does not necessarily have to follow all of them, but they are not supposed to be arbitrary. And so that's very important in this concept, okay? Now, obviously, people are going to have big debates over whether certain things were arbitrary or not. We're not going to resolve whether or not that any given monarch at this time period should be considered a despot as opposed to a sole legislator or just an absolutist. But that's ultimately kind of what is being established here. We're going to talk more about what led up the nobility to allow for this to happen, because I addressed who's allowing this guy to call all the shots and why. Why is this theory even out there? Okay. Now, to help solidify this concept, there was a theory that rulers receive their power directly from God, the divine right of kings. Okay, and this is also kind of interesting to me that only Islam is associated with never being able to separate church and state. Later on, we're going to come up with that concept in the West, but Christianity had most of its legacy in Christian powers, some sort of concept that is similar to this idea of a divine right of the ruler. And part of that comes from the Old Testament, the Hebrew Aramaic scriptures, where one of the kings in the Bible is said to sit on the throne of the Lord. Okay, that you're taking in this power, and Saul, who's the first king in the Bible, has oil poured on his head by the high priest of God, and he becomes a Mashiach, anointed one. Okay, so the idea of being an anointed one came from this first with the idea of a king who would be anointed by a high priest of God, and that his relationship as a ruler would then be tied up into ruling on behalf of God as a human that can intervene in the affairs of humans on behalf of heaven. Okay, that is going to definitely give a lot of authority, because if you think about it now, conceptually, if you break a law, you're not just breaking a law, you're basically making an affront to your king, and you are basically making an affront to your God. Think about the power of that kind of propaganda in terms of the state power, that if you steal bread, Okay, that's also why, in theory, why the French philosopher Michel Foucault talks about some of these grotesque tortures and brutal acts that would be put on, people committing crimes. Is that you didn't just break the law; you were like throwing your middle finger to the king and, dare I say, God. Oh, sorry. Oh, right. My goodness, that's the mess. That is the way that the structure set up. Do you see then how that changes? Um, and so um, that would be very motivating for the average believing citizen to have nothing but respect for the will of authority, okay, in all levels, and really solidify that concept of absolutism. Okay, now um, the practice of it. Um, it was to eliminate or weaken national legislative assemblies. There were events that we're going to talk about that also led up to causing the nobility to see that this is actually great for themselves as well. Okay? So the nobles, often in the middle of these religious wars, were fighting with each other. And out of the chaos, I think it's fair to say that they also saw that it was in their benefit to create some sort of order. And essentially, they're going to have a contract that it's going to say, look, there's privileges that come with being a part of nobility that nobody else is going to have. And the king is going to make sure that they get all of those privileges and that those privileges will be thoroughly protected and that he will use all of the state machinery, such as standing armies, which we're going to talk about more, because there's going to be more and more of this evolving where instead of private armies, you're going to have a standing army. The sovereign will have all of that to back up and protect the interests of the nobles. The nobles then, in return, have to give their complete devotion and subservience to the sovereign. Okay, and this creates a sense of stability as well. I mean, it's very interesting. And when I had you read that comment by that Russian philosopher, and he talked about what the world needs to know about Putin, how Putin put control elites in Russia. I saw another lecture on that when I was over at Berkeley for a presentation on the elections in Putin, and what they were saying was that Putin was able to make elites in Russia stop fighting and know where lines were at so that each person could focus on their own wealth and prestige and there wouldn't be basically mafia wars going on, okay? And that this was good for everybody. And so that for many even analysts of Putin who see him as maybe a threat to Western interests, they can't almost imagine what it'd be like without him because he is kind of creating that stability there, okay? Even Western liberals are making this observation there. And I think the same thing is really going on here, or this is really what's taking place at this time, is this idea that even the nobles are saying, gosh, you're even protecting us from each other. This is great. We all know where we're going to belong, and we're going to have like a strong state, and everybody's interests will be kept intact, okay? That really seems to be what we're talking about. So you are going to see a very different type of thing. What we're really seeing is the rise of the modern nation state here, not those Western liberal democracies that now we think of, when we're talking about the West, of course, but the idea of having a standing army and an infantry that's paid for by the state. There is going to be the phasing out of private armies, okay, which they had before, and you're going to have consistent military training. You're going to have uniforms put in a certain way that have a uniformity about them, okay? And you're going to have taxes imposed on people in which to pay this, okay? And we are going to see, if you remember reading in the text, the growth of standing armies is going to be tremendous. I mean, mind-boggling, actually. And the amount of money that is going to be spent on them is going to be tremendous as well. And it's going to lead to a lot of wars, okay? But I will stop here and I'll move on to the next section.